Hello, welcome to the fiscal year 2019 Maryland Heritage Areas Authority Grantee Orientation. The purpose of this slideshow is to give all those lucky grantees who have worked so hard and received an MHAA grant in fiscal year 2019 an introduction to our grants and to their responsibilities. So here we go. Oh, my name is Ennis Barbary Smith. I'm the Assistant Administrator of the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority. I am also giving this presentation today with Jennifer Neely, who will be jumping in as we go along. She is the Assistant Grants Manager for the Maryland Historical Trust, so she works on not just MHAA grants, but also other grants as well through the Maryland Historical Trust. First of all, congratulations to everyone who's here today and who's watching this webinar because you've already worked really hard to get here and to get an MHAA, a Heritage Area grant. It's a very competitive program. So congratulations on that. There are several items we're going to be going over today. Those include the grant agreement development timeline, so how long it's going to take to process your grant agreement, to get that to you, to get you your payments. We're going to talk about the legal requirements that you need to keep in mind, about navigating your grant agreement document, because it is a long document, but there are certain parts of it that are really important for you to be able to reference quickly. We're going to talk about your grantee responsibilities, which will include reporting, requesting disbursements, financial documentation, record keeping and retention. And we're also going to cover near the end of the presentation a little bit about capital grants and some specific requirements that you need to keep in mind if you've received one of our MHAA capital grants or one of our non-capital grants that involves archaeology or ground disturbance. And then we won't be doing questions and answers today since we're just recording the webinar for the web. But if you have questions, we'll have our contact information on the last slide, so you can reach out to us and ask us questions anytime. So why are we here doing this webinar? We want to ensure good stewardship of state funds. The state of Maryland gets audited too, and so we want to make sure that we're ready for that. We're ready to have all of our documentation lined up. And we also want to keep in mind that all the money that is spent as part of the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority grants comes from Maryland taxpayers. It's part of Project Open Space funding through the real estate transfer tax. So we want to steward Maryland taxpayers' money well. The grant agreement timeline and getting you paid in 10 easy steps. So all of these dates that you see on this slide and the following slide are in fact estimates. They're not guarantees of when exactly different parts of this process are going to happen, but there are best guesses. So just want to keep that in mind. In July, we send award emails. So everyone for fiscal year 2019 would have gotten an email in July announcing that you did receive the grant. Congrats again. Then in July and August, we verify the details of the project and see if you, the grantee, have needed to update anything about your timeline or your budget. We understand that you apply to the grant program, and then there's some time elapses before you're actually awarded a grant. So in some cases, you do need to change some of the details. And in order to go through this process, what you as the grantee need to do is log into your account and complete what's called the project summary sheet. And the sooner you complete that project summary sheet online in your grant account, the same account you use to apply, the sooner we can get to the rest of the steps here that are listed. Until you do that project summary sheet and let us know if you've made any changes, we can't go ahead and start the rest of the process with the grant agreement. So after you do that, the grant agreement is created in our office. It's reviewed by the Office of the Attorney General, and then that grant agreement is going to go out to you, the grantee. And with that grant agreement, you will also receive a request for disbursement form. That form is important for you to go ahead and fill out as well, so that you will be able to get the you'll be able to get your next payment, your first payment, I should say. The next step is, as soon as you get that grant agreement document signed, that request for disbursement signed, you send that back to us as soon as possible. And we're going to get OAG, the Office of the Attorney General, to sign it as well. They're going to do a legal sufficiency review. Then it goes to the higher-ups at the Maryland Department of Planning, who also sign your grant agreement. And then you will receive, the grantee will receive a fully executed grant agreement with all those signatures back to you by email. And you see what we're estimating between November 2018 and February 2019 for this cycle. It's when you would receive that fully executed grant agreement. At the same time that you're receiving that by email, as long as you've already returned to us your request for disbursement form, we can also go ahead and send up to the Comptroller of Maryland a payment request to get you your first payment, which is typically 25% of your grant award. And then your first payment, we are estimating, will be sent to you between December 2018 and March 2019. Again, these are just estimates, especially if it takes longer for us to receive the grant agreement document or another document we need back from you. It may take even longer, unfortunately. And if you've been our grantee in past years, you may see that this is estimated to take a little longer this year than in previous years. That's because we did award more grants this year, which was great. We're so happy to be able to support more projects, but it does mean that some of these steps will take a little bit longer. More on the project summary sheet. So many of you who are watching this will have already completed the project summary sheet online. The purpose of this online form is just to tell us, the Heritage Areas Program, has your timeline changed? Has your budget changed? Has your scope changed? If it has, you go ahead and tell us about that. You can also we ask you to be realistic about how long it will take you to complete the project. And then you enter in all that information. If you don't have any changes to your grant project, you can just write in no changes, and you go ahead and submit that form to us online. So this is important for you to do even if there are no changes, because it allows us to then do the next step in generating your grant agreement. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Jennifer Neely, or Jen Neely, who will be doing part of the presentation now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dennis. So we're going to talk a little bit about the grant agreement. The grant agreement is your legal contract. So with it being a legal contract, you are agreeing to the terms in it. So thus we asked you to read it in its entirety, that you refer to it regularly. Another important thing to make sure is that you're making sure that others in your organization that are involved in the project and that would need to know and be familiar with the grant agreement are also reading it and are understanding the terms in it. The agreement must be signed by someone legally authorized to enter into contracts for your organization, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in this next couple slides. So the corporate resolution form. Only nonprofit organizations are required to complete this form. It's in effect for 3 years. So if you received a grant last year and you completed a corporate resolution form and you received a grant again this year, you would not be required to complete that again unless maybe some board members have changed or you're changing who you're authorizing to sign the agreement or things like that. But if no changes there, then you're good to go based on your resolution form from last year. The form itself basically is just a legal form. It sort of serves to support or supplement the actual grant agreement itself. It's basically just documenting to the fact that your organization, your board, has met that they are aware that that they are entering into this contract with the Maryland Historical Trust and MHAA. Sort of the functionality of the form, there's on page 1, there's a section at the top there where we ask that the secretary or another appropriate title within your organization identifies themselves, and then it's going to be certifying to a series of clauses which are in the form. And another important thing is they're also certifying to the fact that the board did meet and discuss and agree upon this contract that they're entering into with MHAA and MHT. So we're going to ask for the date for that last board meeting where all of those things were agreed upon. And then on the second page, the secretary also identifies and certifies to those folks within an organization that are authorized to enter into such contracts as this grant agreement. So they're considered the official signatories. And then at the bottom, again, the secretary is going to witness to those signatures and date the form. So just another important point about really how this corporate resolution form and the grant agreement sort of tie into each other. Those authorized signatories on page 2 of the resolution form, one of those folks must be the same person that signs the grant agreement. So that's just an important point to make there when we're referencing the corporate resolution, and again, how it relates and supports the actual grant agreement and its function and purpose. So then we'll go on. Let's see, I think we've pretty much covered the important points here in this next slide. Again, there must be a minimum of at least 2 signatories. There could be 2 or more on that second page. And again, the secretary is not one of those signatories. The secretary witnesses at the bottom of that second page of the form. We've covered most of that. Okay. This next slide is getting into a little bit more about legal requirements. So the Maryland Department of Assessment and Taxation. Your organization must be in good standing with SDAT. We cannot execute a grant agreement if you are not in good standing. We cannot issue payments if you are not in good standing. The good thing, though, is usually if you find yourself not in good standing, it's usually a pretty easy fix. It's a form that just hasn't been submitted yet. I believe last year, SDAT did institute a new functionality where you can fix most of those problems online. So we've included the website there for you to go to. And I just suggest that anytime you're coming in for a payment, before you do that, go ahead and check SDAT. Make sure you're in good standing. If you're not, go ahead and start working on getting that corrected, because that will delay you getting your payments down the road. So, okay, 2 important parts of the grant agreement. There's an Exhibit A and an Exhibit B. You will be referring to these 2 parts of the grant agreement very often. So we do suggest that you sort of pull them out, make copies of them on bright colored paper, put them everywhere that's easy to reference, hand them out to folks that will also need to be referencing those or to know about what is contained in those exhibits. It's just a good idea because, again, you will be referencing those quite often. So just to talk about what is contained in Exhibit A, first, so in Exhibit A is your scope of work, your timetables there, any special conditions that may apply to your project, the grantee contribution, which is important to know, your cash match and or in-kind match if you have any, your disbursement schedule, when you're scheduled to be coming in for payments, that's always an important thing, and any reporting requirements you may have. A lot of times the reporting requirements are linked to your disbursement schedule. So again, that's sort of just good things to know, have somewhere that's easy to reference them. And then the second part is Exhibit B. And basically Exhibit B is your approved budget. So again, another important piece to just be very aware of and have easy access to. And then I'm going to pass it back to Ennis. She's going to go over this fancy chart.
Okay, yes, thank you, Jen. So this chart is it's a fun example and a fun activity for you all to be able to go through the question that's inevitably going to come up during your grant, the course of your grant project. Can I do X? Can I do this thing as part of my grant-funded project? Well, you need to ask yourself some of these questions, and perhaps in this order. So first asking yourself, is this in my scope of work? That's one question you might want to ask. And then if the answer is no, you want to think about this pretty carefully about whether you can do this as part of your project or not. You want to ask, is it listed in my budget? So if it's not in your scope of work and it's not in your budget, then you probably can't do it. But you also need to ask, has your project completion date passed? Because if your project completion date, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, has not passed yet, then you can actually ask for an amendment. You can go to your project monitor and ask that we make adjustments to your scope, to your budget, to your timeline. If your project completion date has already passed when you're asking yourself these questions, then unfortunately you won't be able to get an amendment at that point because you didn't request it in time. So that's something, again, we're going to go over a little bit more, but the project completion date's really important, and this chart helps to highlight that. It also helps to highlight that everything that you are allowed to do, it either needs to be already in your budget, already in your scope, and happening within the time period of the grant, or you need to be in contact with your project monitor and asking us if you can get an amendment to make the changes you'd like to make. So some of the terms we just covered, this is kind of a vocabulary slide about what you're going to see in your timetable for your grant when you get your grant agreement in the mail. The first thing is the project commencement date or the project start date. We also refer to this as the project start date sometimes. This date is when your grant-funded and match-funded work can actually begin on the project. For all of you who received grants in fiscal year 2019, that cycle, all of your project start dates are July the 12th, 2018. However, I do want to point out here too the caveat that we have listed on the slide about this, and that is that if your project needs review because you have an easement on the property, or MHT has requested an easement, or because you are required to have a compliance review, you need to wait until those reviews have been completed before you can actually start your grant-funded work. If you don't need those reviews, and we'll get into all the details about who does and doesn't need that, but if you don't need those reviews, you can go ahead and start your project as early as July the 12th and start incurring costs. Your mid-project report due date is also going to be listed in your timeline in your grant agreement. And that mid-project report, depending on how you've decided to schedule your payments, you may need to send us financial documentation, which we'll get into a lot more. But you definitely will need to answer some questions about how your project is going and submit that report online. Now what we have here in red, because it's very, very important, is the project completion date. So I mentioned that on the last slide. And the project completion date is important for several reasons. This is the date listed in your grant agreement when all your funds need to be expended. That's grant and match funds. You can't incur expenditures after this is passed. That will be reimbursable by the grant. This is the date when all the work on the project needs to be completed, and this is the last chance, the last day that you have to request an extension. So that's the thing, is the project completion date isn't set in stone, but if you don't request an extension of that date before it elapses, then unfortunately it would be very difficult for us to help you at that point. So keep this date in mind, put it on all your calendars, print it out, put it in red somewhere so you don't let this go by without requesting an extension if needed. Then your final report due date will also be listed in your grant agreement, and that's a date that's about 2 months after your project completion date, and that's when your final report is due online to us. That will include photos of everything that's been done. It'll include you answering questions about how the project went. Did you produce all the deliverables you thought you were going to produce? And it will also include financial documentation as well, showing us both proof of payment and proof of expenditure, which we will talk about in great detail as we go along here. So the project budget. We understand that what you put in your budget when you submit the application, and even what goes into your budget in the approved grant agreement, that's not always going to line up with how you spend every cent of the money that's associated with this project. So that we understand, the real world is never going to be exactly as planned, and we allow you to make small adjustments in your grant budget. So it's permissible for you to move around 10% or less of the total grant funds between existing line items, very important, existing line items in your approved budget, and you can do that without requesting a budget amendment from us at MHAA. So you can move those small amounts around, and we have some examples to illustrate that here in a few slides. But before we get to those examples, first of all, just some basics about what an amendment can do for you. It can extend the time allotted to complete the project. So things are going a little bit slower than you thought they would, that's fine. We can help you extend it as long as it makes sense and we know that you're progressing on the project. Amendment can also allow for adjustments in your scope of work, and it can allow for adjustments in your budget. That 10% rule, if it's under 10% of the total grant amount that you're moving between existing line items, you don't even need an amendment. But if it's over 10%, and that you want to move around in your budget, or if you want to add a new line item, then in those cases you need to request a budget amendment from us at MHAA. And I do want to point out too that we say small adjustments only in the scope of work amendments that we would approve. It's possible that we would approve a larger adjustment, maybe something really unexpected has happened and you're having to rethink how these funds can be spent. But in those cases, it might be that the staff of MHAA can't approve the amendment you're asking for, that it would actually have to go back to the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority and be approved by the authority's vote rather than a staff decision. So that would take a little bit longer if you are in a unique situation and need to make a larger adjustment to your scope. In order to request an amendment, what you need to do is just email your project monitor with the following information: your grant project title and fiscal year, the reason that you need the amendment, and the changes that you'd like to see made. And then your project monitor will follow up with you at that point and ask you, if they have additional questions, they can follow up, and they may just be able to approve it based on the information you've given there in that email. So getting to the examples that I was mentioning earlier. The first example here is the most wonderful exhibit project. And you can see that in this made-up example, we are allotting money in our approved budget for MHAA for exhibit research that a consultant is doing, for exhibit materials, exhibit installation, for a project manager who's going to work on the project, and for graphic design. And so in the first example scenario that we have, you'll see this question below. If exhibit materials come to $1,900 and graphic design comes to $1,100, so that's $900 over in exhibit materials and $900 under in graphic design, isn't that a convenient amount for it to be off by? Then in this case, would you need to request a budget amendment? And the answer to that is you would not need to request a budget amendment, because you look at the total grant funds that we've awarded, $10,000, and you think, okay, 10% of that is $1,000. So if the change that I'm making between existing line items, if what I'm moving around is below $1,000, and in this case it's $900, then I can go ahead and make that adjustment when I submit my report without having to request a budget amendment. So that is a good example of a scenario when you don't need an amendment. If you're ever in doubt, you can reach out to your project monitor, and they'll be able to talk you through whether you should be requesting an amendment or not. Now, a second example that's similar. This example is a little bit different, so you'll see what it is. If exhibit research comes to $9,300, and that's down from $10,000 total, because you see we're including both the cash match and the grant funds and what's being spent here, and all the other line items are coming in on target, and you want to spend $700 on an exhibit opening reception, do you need to ask for a budget amendment in this case? And the answer would be yes. Now, the reason for that is not because of the amount. $700 is in fact under 10%, under $1,000 of your grant award, but you don't have an existing line item for this opening reception. So you actually would be asking for an amendment probably in your scope of work as well as in your budget to include that exhibit opening reception as part of your grant project. Now that would probably be approved because it sounds like it's something that's very related to everything else you're doing in your project, but you would need to come in and actually request an amendment in order to make that change. Another scenario to consider that you may be wondering about: what if there is money left over in your grant award? So you have completed your project, you've completed all the deliverables you thought you were going to be able to, but you haven't spent as much as you thought you would. Well, first of all, great job on being a good steward of state funds, coming in under budget. That's wonderful. And the first question that you should be asking yourself, and that your project monitor would be asking you if you call them, is there anything else that needs to be done on the project or related to the project? Is there something else that's related that you can spend this money on? And if so, we can help you do a budget amendment or a scope amendment in order to help you spend the rest of your funds, because we don't want that money to necessarily come back to us. We've awarded you, all the grantees, your grants because we know that your projects are going to be amazing and support all the heritage that's so wonderful in Maryland, and we don't want that money to then come back to us. We want you to be able to spend it to make your project and your product the best that it can be. Now, one really important thing to note, though, is that you need to come in and request this before your project completion date. So if you're getting close to your project completion date, close to the end of your project as scheduled, and you realize you're not sure how all your bills are going to come in, are you going to be a little bit under and not have spent all your grant funds or all of your match? Well, if that's the case, I would go ahead and request a project completion, or request an amendment, an extension to your grant at that point, because you need to request that before your project completion date passes. So if you don't know exactly how your expenses are going to shake out, go ahead and request that extension so that you can make changes in your budget if needed. The one important thing to note as well is don't spend and ask for approval later, because if you do that, you might end up with a reduced grant award. You might end up not getting reimbursed for expenses that you thought you might be able to. So there are some things that the MHAA grants just can't pay for. As we've been going over, anything that's not in your budget is not an eligible expenditure, but in general, MHAA grants cannot pay for overhead fees for the applicant organization. So these are things like utilities and rent and staff salaries for work that's not on this specific project. Now, there are things that can be match funded, but not grant funded. So there are things you can include in your matching contribution, but you just couldn't include them as being directly grant funded. Those things include project marketing and staff salaries. And we're going to get into some more detail about the staff salaries on the next coming slides. Some more about match in general. All matching funds must be spent on items directly related to the grant project. Now, that's probably apparent, but something we need to say. It can't be, that you're doing a project on an exhibit or a project on a trail, and then you decide your matching fund is going to be, you're going to include matching expenditures from the gift shop renovation. So no, it needs to be related. It needs to be in your budget. All match must also be spent within the time frame of the grant. So it needs to be spent after your project start date and before your project completion date, which again you can extend if needed. For every dollar of state funds for an MHAA grant, you need to provide $1 of matching contribution because it is a one-to-one grant, dollar for dollar match for all of these MHAA grants. However, up to 25% of that match can be in-kind match, which we'll define here as we go along, and you're probably already aware of what that means. But we do require at least 75% of your matches to be cash match at this point. The approved match expenditures are also listed in your budget. So if what you're spending your match on changes, you're going to need approval for that in the form of a budget amendment. However, the source of your match can change, and that's what we have in red at the bottom of this slide. So maybe you thought that you had one grant or one funding source when you applied and you sent us documentation that you had that match in hand, but then you find out, oh, I've got this private donation that actually wants to cover what I wanted to spend my match on. So if that's the case, that's fine. You don't need to let us know that the source of your match has changed. The only thing to keep in mind is you cannot use state funds to match your MHAA grant. So you can't use any other state grant source, any other state funding of any type. Some more on match. So in terms of cash match, staff salaries of the applicant organization, so that's the organization that's actually on the grant agreement, the organization that is the official applicant, the official grantee, staff salaries for that organization for time spent working on the project itself can count as cash match. And again, you would need to have this in your budget laid out as well. And if you want that to be in your budget, you'd need to, and it's not, you'd need to ask for an amendment. Cash purchases and expenditures, so things you're spending money on that are in your budget, that are part of the grant project, all of that is also cash match. Now, in-kind match, that can include volunteer time, staff time from other organizations, not the applicant, not the grantee organization, and again, for work directly related to the project in terms of both volunteer time and staff time from other organizations. In-kind match can also include donated professional services or discounts and donated materials. So an example of that is maybe you have in your budget that you're going to have some plumbing done as part of your grant project. And you have that you've already talked with the plumber and you already put in your budget that part of that plumbing work is going to be in kind. Maybe he's going to give you 10% off the total. And he or she would need to write that in the invoice, showing that they're giving you that discount, and showing what the value of their in-kind donated professional services are. And then that could be accepted as part of your in-kind match. So keep that in mind. There are lots of ways to use in-kind match that are important. Another thing to keep in mind when you're doing your reporting for these grants is that we would like to see information about your other project costs. Your other project costs include everything that's above and beyond what you spent on your match and what the grant funds were able to pay for. So if you're building a building, you may have grant funds from MHAA, you may have the matching funds that you're using to match that, and then you may have additional costs. And we would like to see you include those in your reports and listing out what your other project costs were, because that helps us show how much money our grants are leveraging. That's very important for MHAA as we continue to seek funding from the state to show that the economic impact of the MHAA grants is so great. And so please continue listing that. However, you don't need to send us the financial documentation, the actual proof of expenditure, and proof of payment for your other project costs. So they're not subject to the same reporting requirements, but we would like to see that listed on your forms that you fill out. Recording volunteer hours. And again, volunteer hours are such a big part of many of these projects and many of your organizations. You need to keep a log of your volunteer hours, and that log can take the form of either volunteers completing timesheets that they would sign off on, or it can take the form of a spreadsheet that the volunteer monitor or the project monitor, whoever's in charge of that, would be keeping track of everything and signing off on. In both cases, you want to include a lot of information that's specific about what the volunteers are doing. So you would want to include the volunteers' names, the date, when, where, what they were doing, how many hours it took for them to do this. If it's not apparent, how what they were doing is actually related to the grant project, because we can only cover as part of the match things that are related to the grant project specifically in terms of volunteer time. So try to include all those things in your log or your timesheets for your volunteers, so we have all the information that we need going forward for the reports. And then once you have all that recorded, what the volunteers, what they're actually doing and how much time they're spending, you can multiply their total hours by the value of volunteer time in Maryland, which is currently $27.50. So it's a great rate to be able to recognize what the volunteer's time really means. And you can check that rate because it does change. It gets updated at independentsector.org/volunteer_time. And we have a screenshot from that website here showing that this is a rate that's specific to Maryland in 2017. And again, check back before you fill out your reports because they may have a 2018 rate posted and it might be higher. So go ahead and make sure to check that and use that rate. All right, so getting into the nitty-gritty of your grant agreements in terms of procurement. So this is what we require as part of your grant agreement in terms of your procurement procedures. The local governments, we just ask that you follow your normal procedures for procurement. We know that you already have processes in place, and we just ask that you follow that and document it as you always do. For nonprofits, it's a little bit different. We ask that if you have an expenditure, not a total line item, not the total for your budget, but one expenditure that's going out to a contractor or like a big order of supplies, and it's between $500 and $10,000, you need to ask for need to get and obtain 2 or more written bids from vendors. If you have an expenditure that you're looking at as part of your grant project that's actually above $10,000 and you're a nonprofit, we ask that you get at least 3 written bids from vendors. So those are important things for you to do as part of your requirements and terms for this grant agreement. Now, you're not required to take the lowest bid, but you must document what criteria was used to choose. So we want you to be able to complete the project, have the best product possible. We understand that's not always the lowest bid, but you need to be documenting why you chose the contractor or the service or the supplier that you chose. Along the same vein, you can also document that you needed to have a sole source procurement for this expenditure. And this should only be utilized when you can document a valid reason for why you needed to do this sole source. So it might be that you've been working with a specific contractor who has a lot of knowledge and a lot of specialization in what you specifically are working on for your project. And if you can show that, show their qualifications, have a memo to file in your files showing why you did this sole source procurement, that's fine. But please keep that in mind. We don't want you to not have that documented and then we ask for it and to have to go back and figure out why you decided to do that. Another thing to keep in mind is if your capital grant is $90,000 or greater, when you receive your grant agreement, you're also going to receive a form that asks you to complete a Minority Business Enterprise, MBE plan. And what you're going to do on that form is set a goal for yourself about how much, what percentage of your project you would like to see go to minority business enterprises, what percentage of the expenditures of your project. And then, so you set that goal on the form, and then in your subsequent reports, you're going to be asked about whether you're meeting that goal and why or why not. You're not going to be penalized if you do not meet the goal, but it's something that's so important to keep in mind and so important to try to strive to meet the goal if possible. So we've gone over a lot of responsibilities that you have as a grantee to the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority. And at this point, I just want to kind of wrap up this one section and summarize what we've talked about so far. We're asking that you keep to the timeline of your grant project, keep to the budget, document all your expenditures and payments, ask MHAA to review drafts and acknowledge support, and we're going to talk about that a little bit on the next slide. Stay in compliance with the Department of Assessment and Taxation, SDAT, because you want to be able to get your payments, as Jen said. And basically we're saying we want you to be able to finish the project, do what you said you were going to do, and stay in communication with us along the way. So if you do need an amendment or you do need to make a change in some way, that your project monitor is aware and working with you to make that change if needed. So acknowledging MHAA support. In all publications that are a part of your grant project, anything that's public facing like a brochure, an interpretive sign, an exhibit, a book that's being produced like a cookbook or something, anything that's forward facing like that, a building, perhaps there's some signage that's introducing the building, you need to be including the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority logo that's shown here. And we can send that to you by email as needed, different versions of it, different resolutions of it. It's a lovely logo right here. You also need to be including this, this statement, giving credit to MHAA. And if this statement is too long, or it's just not the right format, not the right tone for what you are trying to produce, then your project monitor can work with you to find a way to shorten the statement or find a way to change it so that it fits in with what you're producing. But you do need to include either this statement, which is in your grant agreement, or something that you've had your project monitor agree on in all those publications. And please don't forget to include your local heritage areas logo too. They have some beautiful logos, and I'm sure they've been super instrumental in helping you to get the grant from MHAA in the first place. They deserve a lot of credit for all the work that they do. So include their logo too. And we've made it halfway through the webinar here today. So we're going to just continue forward, but if you're watching this at home, maybe this is a good place to take a break. So reporting and documentation. All the reports that you do as part of your MHAA grant are going to be submitted online. They're actually submitted through the same system that you used to apply for the grant in the first place. So you go to mht.maryland.gov and you will see on the left-hand side of your screen this nice magenta, maroon, purple My Grant Account button under Resources. We have it circled here on the image. So you go to that My Account button and you'll be able to log in. And you will be using the same credentials that you used to create your grant application. It's been a while since you applied for the grant. If you did forget your password, that's no problem. Just click the Forgot Password link and it will send your password to the email address that's associated with your account. If you need to change the email address, get in contact with one of us at MHAA or MHT and we can help you switch that email address out if needed to a new staff member or a new volunteer. And then when you go to fill out your reports and upload the documents that are required, you're going to also be asked to answer some questions. How is your grant going? What deliverables? Have you been able to produce all the deliverables you said you would? Describe any differences, things like that. Some pretty standard reporting questions letting us know how the project is progressing. And when you fill out forms as part of your reports, one thing to really keep in mind that we have in red here is that you want to refer to the version of the budget that appears in your grant agreement when you're submitting your report. So basically, when you apply to our grant program, we want you to include all kinds of detail in the budget. You know, maybe you've got 20 line items, you have specific numbers of chairs and tables. We want to know exactly what you would plan to do with the money. But after we know you've figured that out, we want to try to give you some flexibility for real-world changes. So a lot of times we will combine line items in your budget that are related. So the budget that you see in your grant agreement when you get it in the mail, that's the final approved budget, it may look a little different than the budget that you submitted when you applied to the grant program. And our intent with all of that is to be able to give you flexibility, not to put too much detail in there that, you know, if the price of the chairs that you wanted to buy changes by $5, you're going to be off and we're going to be contradicting the budget. We don't want something like that to happen. So the whole point of what I'm explaining here is just refer to the budget that's in your grant agreement. That is the final approved budget you need to use when you're filling out your reports. All right, and at this point, I'm going to pass the presentation back to Jen Neely, who's going to go over some more about the disbursement form.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ennis. As Ennis is going through submitting some forms through the online system, one important form, obviously, is your request for disbursement form. So what we're talking about here really is probably more your second and third request for disbursement form payment requests. The first one, as we mentioned prior, will come with your grant agreement, and you'll sign that and send that in because that is an automatic 25%. So this slide really really does apply more to that second and third payment request. So we just ask that you, when you do go in to upload the form, that you make sure that it is signed and completed, and that you're usually coming in at the same time that you're submitting a progress report, either a mid or a final report. If you do not submit that request for a reimbursement form, we will not process your payment. So just make sure that's included in when you're submitting those progress reports. We also ask that when you are signing the form that you don't just type your name, that you do actually provide a hand signature and that you date the form itself. So just some important things to keep in mind when you are going to complete that form and submitting it. Just again, really so you were not running into any kind of delays with you getting your reimbursement at this point for your payment requests. How do I fill out the request for disbursement form? So again, referencing back to that first request for disbursement form, what I do on that form is just sort of cross out the area that we're going to be going over in these next couple of slides, because really all you need to do, because it is an automatic 25%, is just sign and date that form and get it back with your grant agreement, and then we'll sort of take it from there. So these next few slides are more applicable to your second and final payment requests. So I'm going to go over the bullets that are outlined here on this slide using the next slide. So I'm going to forward on to the next slide. So this top section here, is sort of more just some identification information for you and your agency. Here we've got your EIN number. This section here, a lot of folks think that it's when you actually sign the grant agreement and send it back to us, and it's not. It's actually the date when that grant agreement is fully executed, meaning that all of the signatures are on the grant agreement, and being that last signature, which is the designee for the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority, who's actually our Assistant Secretary for the Department of Planning. So once the Assistant Secretary signs, the grant agreement then comes back to us and we consider it fully executed. And at that point, we will scan and send that grant agreement in an email back to you. So again, just to clarify, that's the date that the designee or the Assistant Secretary signs. Here we've got the disbursement request number. So for this example, it's a second payment request. We've got the amount that the grantee has received to date. So they've gotten a first payment, which was $6,000. So they're identifying that, okay, so far to date, I received $6,000. And then this field here is for what you're coming in for this payment request. So for this particular example, it's $12,000 because it's the second payment. And then name and address of grantee, and then contact information here. Now, just to note that when I do create those first disbursement request forms and send to you in your grant agreement, I do fill out this section for you. So it's a good idea just to make a photocopy of that. So when you come in to complete for the second and final payments, you kind of just have it as a reference, and it's a little bit easier for you to remember exactly, again, like this date and things like that. So just a suggestion there. So the gray columns down here in this section here are the amounts from your approved budget from your grant agreement or your approved budget amendment. So again, it's just those approved totals. So really what you're doing is just sort of transposing that approved budget or that approved amendment here on this form in these gray columns. Now for the white columns, some of them you are again just sort of transposing again or copying over from your approved budget or your approved grant budget amendment, line item numbers, your line item descriptions. These next few columns here, though, are going to be what you've spent to date. So here, for line item 1, you've been approved grant funds for $5,000 for brochure design, and to date you've spent $4,300. So again, these white columns are what you've spent to date. You're telling us how you've been spending in these columns. So we just ask that as you complete the form, you please just make sure that you're totaling each line item, each column, that you're checking your totals, things like that. Down here on this bottom section, again, here's the date that the designee or the assistant secretary signs that grant agreement and makes it fully executed. Here is where we ask for your hand signature or whoever may be signing and approving this request for payment, their title, and the date that they're submitting this payment request form. This bottom section, as you see here, is state use only. We complete that so you don't have to worry about that. Just a quick exercise to explain all of the different parts of this form, because I know the first time you look at it, it does seem a bit overwhelming and confusing. So I hope this is helpful. Next, we're going to talk about some financial reporting requirements. So in receiving these state funds, we are responsible to make sure that we are spending them responsibly. And to do that, we need to make sure that we're providing well-documented expenditures. We're providing proof of payment. We're using cost-efficient operations, and we're following proper procurement procedures. So that's all pretty straightforward. And then, in reviewing the cost, obviously we're just going to make sure that it's an eligible cost, that it's in your approved budget or your amended budget, that it is necessary for the completion of the project, that it is reasonable, and that it is verifiable. Just a few important points to make. Grant funds can only be spent on those parts of the project set forth in that approved grant budget. So that approved grant budget, there's another piece of your grant agreement that's referred to as the scope. So it's sort of the paragraph that describes what your project is and what it's about, talks about match and grant funds and generally what those are going to cover. The budget is the piece that really sort of pulls that out line item by line item. So again, grant funds can only be spent on what is included in that approved grant budget. Okay, financial documentation. So you must provide financial documentation with both the mid-project report and your final report. So beginning in FY18, we instituted some new documentation requirements at the mid-project or second payment request point, which included documentation of expenditures. And we'll get into more about what that means, but just a new additional requirement we added last year that we're carrying over to this year. So, and just a note that for management grants, those new requirements do not apply. This is for, capital, non-capital projects, marketing projects, those types of projects. So getting into more about what we mean when we say expenditure and payment. So you must show documentation of expenditure. So what is that? We're talking about an invoice, a receipt, a signed contract, proof that you have expended a certain amount of money for a particular item. When we're referencing contract, we're mentioning, for example, say you hired some reenactors and there really wasn't an invoice, there wasn't a particular receipt, but there is this signed contract that those reenactors agreed to do X, Y, and Z, and you've agreed to pay them a certain amount. That, in that instance, would constitute as an expenditure. So you could provide documentation if that was your particular situation as an expenditure. But again, prove that you've expended money on particular items in your approved budget. So you must also show documentation of payment. Now, just a reminder again that this applies only to that final and third payment request. So if you're coming in for your second payment request, we're just looking for proof of that expenditure, the invoice, the receipts. When you're coming in for that third payment, we're going to be looking for both proof of expenditure and proof of payment, bank statements, canceled checks, receipts for all of the expenditures from the first payment, from the second payment or reimbursement request, and this third. So just an important note there. Those expenditures and payments must align with the final approved budget, again, driving that point home, which must be filled in on your request for disbursement form. And again, we talked about scanning and uploading the document with your mid-project and your final reports. Okay, so when we're talking about these things, let's talk a little bit about what we specifically are and are not looking for. So we are not looking for invoices and receipts that are impossible to link to the budget or discern what they are for. So when you're collecting your financial documentation, we just ask that if it's not obviously clear that this invoice is for this particular line item, that you just label them. Or just clearly note on those invoices, those receipts, those documents, hey, this is for line item 3, which is this. You know, just some way that's easier for us if it's not immediately clear that we know what that particular piece of documentation applies to. We do not want documentation that doesn't relate to the current project. So, you know, that sort of don't throw in the kitchen sink and figure, well, more is better. It just becomes more confusing. So you know better on your end probably than we would at that point which documentation would relate directly to the project. So please make sure that you're including those pieces of documentation and not just a bunch of other stuff, because it just confuses me, and it takes me a little bit longer and sometimes a lot longer to go through all of that and sift through it all to pull out exactly what it is that I do need. Math errors, obviously we're all human. Just asking that you sort of, rerun the numbers, maybe 2 or 3 times before you submit, just to make sure everything adds up and is correct. We do not want expenditures for which there is no invoice and or proof of payment. So for example, you're coming in for your 3rd and final payment. We don't want to see an invoice for a particular line item or a particular piece of the project or that doesn't have a matching proof of payment. So if there's an invoice, for example, for a plumber, we would want to see either a bank statement, clear check, somewhere that invoice to that plumber, for example, was paid. So that's what we're looking for there. Printouts from QuickBooks or other accounting software. Generally, these are not allowed on their own. You may provide them as supporting documentation, but generally, we cannot accept just QuickBooks or other accounting software as a standalone unless you are a government agency. In that case, we can accept accounting printouts from your accounting system. Okay, what we do want. So this is sort of repetitious, but again, we want invoices and proofs of payment that are clearly labeled by budget category and line item. So for example, this invoice is for line 1 for the research consultant. That is perfect. That's what we're looking for. Volunteer and staff hour timesheets and pay stubs, if applicable. And Ennis went over in some detail about what we are looking for when you're submitting documentation for volunteer time. Staff hour, very similar. We're looking for timesheets, clearly documented spreadsheets that provide the name, what that person did, when they did it, how long they did it, totals, things like that. We do want documentation that matches the individual budget line items. So if we add up all the invoices together, they should equal the line item's actual expenditure amount. So really what that means is, again, going back to when we sort of, when I put the sample request for disbursement form up, that form, when you're submitting it, should match or should mirror that approved budget. That's like the most general, clear way to say line item for line item, amount for amount, totals for totals. So. Okay, we're going to talk, or get into a little bit more about payments, which I know everyone's very interested in. So you will receive 3 scheduled payments under your grant agreement. As we mentioned, you'll get that first payment, which is an automatic 25%. You'll get that up front without any documentation requirements. So you will not need to provide documentation of expenditure and or payment for that first payment. It's basically when we receive that signed grant agreement, it goes through the steps of legal sufficiency, it's fully executed, we send it to you in that email. If we do, again, have that signed first disbursement request form from you, we can go ahead and process that first payment right away. Your second and third payments will be reimbursable for the expenditures made and will require documentation. So again, second payment, expenditure documentation. Coming in for your third payment, we're looking for expenditure documentation and proof of payment documentation at that point. Okay, for the second payment, you may request up to 50%. So you've already got your first payment, you've already got your 25%. So you're coming in for your second payment. You may request up to 50% of your grant award at this point at your mid-project report. So to be able to do that, you must submit a mid-project progress report, documentation of expenditure of up to 50% of grant funds and matching contributions combined. So just a note there that it doesn't have to be a certain amount of grant funds that you have to provide expenditure documentation for and a certain amount of matching cash or in-kind that you have to provide expenditure documentation for. We're looking for a combination. We would like to see that you are spending both grant and matching funds as you're going along, but just a note there that it doesn't have to be a certain amount or percentage of grant or match. It's a combination. And then again, a completed request for disbursement form at that point for the second payment. This next slide is sort of an example of what we're talking about and a breakout for that second payment based on a $10,000 grant award. So you've got $10,000 in MHAA grant award money. You're required to match that with $10,000 of either cash match or combined cash and in-kind. So you've got a total combined grant and match of $20,000 for this particular project. Now, if you're coming in for your second payment, again, you're eligible for up to 50% of that grant award amount. So in order for you to receive that entire 50%, or $5,000, because your grant award amount is $10,000, you need to document that you've spent 50% of the combined grant and match. So you need to show us with expenditure documentation that you've spent $10,000. So for the second payment, again, you're documenting 50% of the combined grant and match at the mid-project. So in doing this, you've shown us, this is just sort of another way to say what we've just went over in the example for the second payment. So basically, you're showing that you've spent your first payment in grant and combined match. You've matched that, again, grant and combined and match combined. And again, we are wanting to see that you're spending both grant, not just grant money, but both grant and match. And it can be cash and or in-kind. And then at that second payment, you're showing us that you've then also, after you've documented that you've spent the first payment, you've matched that first payment, you're showing us that then with expenditure documentation that you've spent even more, which is that up to 50%. And again, just a reminder that you do not need to provide proof of payment at that second payment stage. If you happen to have it, feel free to go ahead and submit that with that second payment so that we do have it on file. So when you come in for your third payment, you don't need to submit it, but it is not required. Again, just proof of expenditure for that second payment is what the documentation requirement is at that point. So here's an example, again, of a disbursement request form that has been completed for a second payment. So we see we've got it completed. We've identified it as payment number 2. Let's see, the total grant amount award was $12,000. So it's a little bit different than the example we just went over for second payments. So this grant award amount is for $12,000. It's our second. So in that first 25%, we're documenting, yes, we did receive $3,000 in our first payment. And here we're coming in for our second payment, which is up to 50%, so that would be $6,000. So we've identified the line items, we've identified the descriptions, and again, this is all directly from your approved budget or your approved amended budget. Again, these gray fields here, exactly what that approved budget identifies or has. You're just sort of transposing those numbers. And then you're telling us at this point what you've spent to date in grant funds, which is $8,000, and you're telling us again what you've spent to date in cash match and in kind. So we have sort of a summary of this laid out on a slide. So again, sort of referencing this, but I'm going to move on to this next slide, which is again summary of this example. So again, our grant amount was $12,000. Our cash and in-kind combined was a total of $12,000 because it's 1 for 1. So we've got a $24,000 combined grant and grant fund and match project. So for documentation of expenditure for the second payment, like I said, we've documented on the top there that for the first payment we did receive $3,000. So on that disbursement form, in what we've actually spent on those white columns, we've shown that we have spent the entire first payment amount, which is $3,000. We've shown that we've matched that with another $3,000, so $6,000. And actually, in the example on the request for disbursement form on just the prior slide, we actually spent a little more. So just to point that out so there's no confusion there. And then, because this is the second payment, we're coming in for and documenting that we've spent more than that. So for this particular request, we can say that we spent up to 50%, which is $6,000 more dollars. And again, in that prior screen on the disbursement form, we've documented in those white columns that we have, in fact, expended that amount. Now, when you're submitting this second payment request form, we're also going to provide the expenditure documentation supporting that we've spent that. And I know that's a little confusing without actually walking through an exercise and just talking, through slides. So I hope that the way I described that was clear. Now, one thing to point out here, too, is that if we had documented less than that $6,000 or less than that up to 50%, we would not be able to get all of that as a reimbursement payment. You would only be able to be reimbursed for what you can provide in expenditure documentation at that second payment stage. And again, at the end of this presentation, you'll get our emails and our phone numbers. If you have any questions, please do give us a call. And again, we talked about this, but just to reiterate for the third payment, at this point, when you're coming in for your final and your third payment with your final progress report, you must document both proof of expenditure and proof of payment. And basically, at that point, really, because that second payment is up to 50%, so some people may come in for all of that 50%, some may not be able to come in for all of that up to 50%. So at this third payment, at that stage, it's really whatever's left to document and request for reimbursement for your project is what you're coming in for this third payment. Okay, so now that we've talked about how to complete the disbursement form, how to request reimbursement, what documentation is required, at what point, at what payment, or what payment request. Once you've submitted, either it's your second or your final payment, once you've submitted all of that documentation and signed the forms and you've uploaded everything, now you want to know, okay, how long is it going to take to actually get this reimbursement? Because again, at the second and third, it is basically a reimbursement payment situation. So we suggest really giving that window of time to be about 60 days. So again, for the first request for disbursement, again, that's an automatic 25%. So we're saying that payment should be within 60 days once you receive that fully executed grant agreement. Once I email you that fully executed grant agreement, I usually do include a note saying, okay, here's your grant agreement, I have your request for disbursement, so I can now at this point process your first payment. So once you get that email, just to be safe, I would give it about 60 days to actually see that money in your account. The second disbursement request form, a few extra steps, but again, that 60 days does still apply. So you're going to submit the mid-project report, you're going to document your expenditures to date, you're going to complete and submit the disbursement form. And then, again, once you've uploaded that, again, give yourself about 60 days to expect that reimbursement. Same thing for the final disbursement request. The final payment will not be made until the final report is approved. So that's an important point there. Once you submit the reports and the request for disbursement, the reports are actually reviewed so that we can see what your progress is going through the project. Those need to be approved, and then that sort of initiates that approval for payment. So just a point there to be aware of. And again, you must be in good standing with the Department of Assessment and Taxation to receive payment. So, you know, again, we provided the website in that prior slide. Always check before you're submitting your payments or as you're getting them ready. So if you do need to clarify or correct anything there, you've got time to do that. It doesn't delay your payment. This is just a slide about direct deposits for payments. We do suggest that you do get yourself set up with direct deposit, and you can do that through the Office of the Comptroller. We cannot do that for you. That is something you would have to go and do yourself. We provided the 1888 number, and just to save some time, it is option 7, so you don't have to go through all of the recording. So just a helpful hint there. It's just an easier and quicker way for you to receive your payments. You know, things get lost in the mail if you're doing paper checks and those sorts of things. So just a suggestion, some information there if you do want to go that route. A few notes on record keeping and retention. We just ask that you do keep records while you're doing your project, while you're going along through the project. Please do not wait until the very end to start collecting things like daily timesheets, volunteer time, creating that spreadsheet once everything's all done. It's just much harder to do and to recreate than doing it as a project is progressing. Same goes for proof of expenditure and proof of payments. You know, as you're expending money, as you're paying those invoices, as you're receiving your monthly bank statements, start collecting those and getting those organized, labeling those by line item number, whatever way is best to identify what those are for. Again, as you're going through the project, please don't wait until the end, because sometimes it's almost impossible if it's a big project or a long project to really get all those pieces recreated. So again, just doing it along the way makes life much easier, I think. Grantees must keep all materials related to the grant for 5 years from the project completion date. So that's just another important point to point out, that once your grant has ended, you've got your final payment, and we've said, okay, your grant file is closed out, you still need to keep those materials for 5 more years. So it's always better to have ready somewhere safe So if you are asked to pull those for whatever purposes, auditing, whatever, that you do have them. It just makes life, again, much easier. And I think then this passes back to Ennis, and she's going to go over capital projects.
Yes, thank you, Jen, and thanks for figuring out which option they actually need to select on the direct deposit. I'm sure that'll be helpful in saving people a lot of time. So to go over some specific requirements that we, MHAA grants, that we have for capital projects and for non-capital projects that involve ground disturbance. So if you know that you have a non-capital project, that's the application you filled out for MHAA, and you're not disturbing the ground either through archaeology or installing signage or something similar, then these next few slides will not apply to you, but for everyone else, it will apply to you. So, and just to go over the basics, when you submitted your application to MHAA, you either applied for a capital MHAA grant or a non-capital MHAA grant. And the capital grants usually refer to bricks and mortar projects, things like repairing, preserving a building, constructing a new structure, constructing a trail, things like that. Those are capital projects. Non-capital projects are pretty much anything, everything, and anything else. But again, even if you have a non-capital project and you are disturbing the ground in some way, either through archaeology or through installing some interpretive signage as another example, or something else that disturbs the ground, then you also are subject to these requirements for compliance and easement review. So the questions you need to be asking yourself if you're in one of these categories is there an existing easement on my property? So perhaps you know, or if you don't know, you need to find out that you already have a preservation easement through MHT, and you already are familiar with the process of submitting any changes you want to make through the easement committee on like a change form, showing what changes or updates you would want to make to the property. You know that you have to get everything approved through the easement committee and ultimately through the director of the Maryland Historical Trust. Another scenario that you need to ask yourself if this applies to you is, are we, MHAA, requiring that you convey an easement as part of the terms and conditions of your MHAA grant award? That is something that we ask all applicants to be aware of and to agree to when they apply, and to be aware of that MHT, Maryland Historical Trust, may indeed require as one of the terms of this MHAA grant that you're conveying an easement to us on your property, on your building. And so if that's the case, we need to start that process as well before we can give you any payments or get anything finalized with the work you want to complete for your project. The third question that you need to ask yourself is, do I need compliance review? And these are cases where you don't have an easement on your property, you haven't been asked to provide a preservation easement on your property to MHT, but you're still doing a capital project like any kind of building construction, any kind of building renovation or repair, any kind of trail construction. All of those things, even if you don't have an easement, require compliance review. Interpretive signage, installing that in the ground as well, and requires compliance review. And so you don't want to begin any of the work on your project before you know the answers to these questions. It's very important, because then if you do begin work, you might have to reverse it if it's not approvable by either the easement committee or our compliance team. More about easements. If you have one, you probably already know this, but for everyone else, it's a legal contract between the property owner and the state. It transfers partial interest in the real property to the state, and this conveys certain development rights. It conveys with the transfer of ownership. So each easement is unique to the property. Each easement protects against changes to the property that are inconsistent with the preservation of the property. And the state has legal authority and responsibility to enforce the easement, which includes inspections, review, and approval of changes. If the terms are not upheld, reversal, we may ask, MHT may ask that you actually reverse those changes that you made, and there may be other penalties as well, which is something we don't want to have happen. So get your changes approved beforehand if you have an easement. And easements are perpetual. I was getting at that a moment ago. They convey with the property. So even if you aren't the property owner who signed up for this easement, you may have one on your property because the previous owner conveyed that to the Maryland Historical Trust. And likewise, even if you sell the property or move on to a different space, that easement will transfer along with the property ownership. Now, I want to go back one slide. If you are required to convey an easement or you already have an easement on your property, you need to take the first step in making sure the work that you want to do as part of your grant agreement, as part of your grant project with MHAA, is approved by the easement committee. So just because you got the grant from MHAA does not mean that that work is actually approved by the easement committee and by the director of the Maryland Historical Trust. So you got the grant. The next step is filling out that paperwork that you're probably already familiar with and sending that to the easement committee so that the easement folks and easement staff can take a look and see if the changes that you want to make as part of your, or want to construct or anything as part of your grant project with MHAA can actually be approved. So you need to have that letter in your hand from the easement folks before approving what you want to do before you should start on any part of your MHAA project. Now, compliance review is different because compliance review you do not need to initiate. Basically, when we approved your grant project, we flagged that it needed compliance review, if indeed it did, because it wasn't subject to easement review and because all these projects are undertakings. So any project that's funded with MHAA money, that means it's funded with state money. And so because of that, it's defined as an undertaking and it requires compliance review under these sections of the law. And so anything that you're doing on your property, again, constructing a trail, signage, disturbing the ground in any way, all of that our compliance team is going to go ahead and review without you having to ask them to. They'll do that because we've given them a list of your grant projects. And they're going to be looking at your application materials, the maps, the site plans, the descriptions of work, the drawings that you've included with your application to see if they understand exactly what you're going to be doing. If they do not understand something about your project when they're doing this compliance review, then they will reach out to you and ask you for more information. An example is maybe you want to construct a trail and you've planned out where exactly that trail is going to be. You've provided a map, but when the compliance team takes a closer look, they notice that there's a possibility it's getting very close to some archaeological resources that they're aware of in that area, and they would want to make sure in that case that they're able to work with you to divert around those cultural resources, so that when we create a heritage tourism resource, when we create whatever product your project is creating, that you're not disturbing any other resources in the process. So they'll work with you, and they're very good to work with. See, don't they look friendly? And again, they'll reach out to you if they need more info, but typically they can use what you've already provided in your application, and you don't need to provide us anything else. We will do that compliance review in the background. But before you start on your project, if you know that's happening, then please go ahead and contact your project monitor, because we need to be able to say, yes, your compliance review has been completed if you have any doubt, and let you know that you are free to move forward with the project. And the whole point behind all these slides about easements and compliance review for capital projects is that you should find out what the requirements are now for your specific project so that you don't have to make changes later, because they could be expensive changes. And in summary, for really the whole presentation, we want you to be clear on what your grantee responsibilities are, but one of the biggest responsibilities that you have is just talking to us and asking questions as we go along. So don't be afraid to reach out to Jen Neely or myself or your other project monitors, Jen Ruffner or Courtney Hotchkiss, because all of us are eager to help you and help answer your questions about your project so that you can accomplish it in the best possible way. We want your grant experience to be like this, dancing on a mountain in flowers, just being very, very happy with the grant experience with paperwork. And we don't want your grant experience with us to be this, confusion, dismay, just general wondering, being confused about what the requirements are, and surprised as you go along. We do not want that. So to help avoid that, any additional questions that you have, please reach out to any of us. This is me right here, Ennis, Barbary Smith, and Jen Neely was our other wonderful presenter who we had today. Courtney Hotchkiss and Jen Ruffner may also be your project monitors. You'll be able to see that on your grant agreement. It will list your project monitor, and they will have signed your grant agreement. It's also on your project summary sheet. And if you're unsure about who your project monitor is, just reach out to any of us, and we will find out for you and let you know. So thank you all so much for watching. I know it's a lot of information, but it's really important to have all of this up front and as you start your project, and please do contact us with any questions. Thanks.